Okay, kia ora, koutou katoa, and welcome to this session of the Marlborough Book Festival. My name is James Healy. I'm from Dog Point Vineyard, one of the original and persistent sponsors of this book festival. And I can tell you that we're extremely pleased to be part of it. We think it's an excellent addition to just what happens here in this region. It is Dog Point's pleasure to welcome Kate to Goldi and Lloyd Jones to the Marlborough Book Festival. They're two acclaimed authors who really need no introduction, and both of you, we're delighted to welcome you here in Marlborough to this festival. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, James. Tēnā koutou katoa. Warm greetings, everybody. While James is just there, I have to acknowledge just how fantastic this festival has been and how generous this local community has been in treating us. Wonderful.
Fabulous.
James made a mistake. He popped over to Dog Point yesterday and asked, is everything okay? Do you need anything? And I preposterously said, is there any more wine? And off he went. Anyway, so look, this session, this is Kate, obviously. I'm Lloyd. This session is hatched from a conversation I had with Kate a couple of months ago. We were talking about books, mainly books we'd read as when we were children that had a big impact on us, and how we had investigated the landscape of those books later in life. And so we came up with the title of Landscape in Literature. And it was only when I saw it in cold print, Landscape in Literature, I thought, what idiot said landscape? And I realised it was me. Because I'm not sure if I mean landscape or do I mean place, or are they the same thing? Maybe we'll get to the bottom of this. Or the much sweeter, beautiful word that we have here, Tauranga Waiwai, which will indeed sort of get to the source of what we're talking about. Yeah. So anyway, I'll make a few observations, I think, about we'll go with literature. What did we say? Landscape and literature, and then I'll get Kate to respond to some of these ideas, and we'll go from there. At the end, there will be a few readings, and at the end there'll be an opportunity to ask questions if you want to. And I just noticed there's no clock.
Yeah, there is.
There is. Oh, good. Well done, Kate. Right. Okay. So I'll mention some of Kate's achievements, actually. I've known Kate for a very long time. And in fact, it occurred to me that I commissioned one of your first pieces of writing. Kate had the courage to admit she couldn't swim and had only learnt swimming late in life. I said, Kate, you've got to write a piece about that.
I actually still can't swim. The lesson didn't really work.
Yeah. No, right. Yeah. If you knew how Kate drives and how she sort of physically functions in the world, that would be no surprise. But anyway, since then, Kate has become really an indispensable voice in children's literature in this country. Just, as a broadcaster, as a writer. She's written children's picture books and books for young readers, and novels that seem to hover in some sort of space between that horrid YA category that we were talking about, or you were talking about to Kim Hill the other day, and a more general reader. And among those novels, there's Closed Stranger. I think of that being a little bit more of a adult novel, Kate, than YA. But having said that, why do we even place these categories on these sorts of things? Anyway, you will be aware of the 10 p.m. question. That won a whole slew of awards, including the Korean International Book Prize for young readers in Germany, which was a wonderful thing to happen. And of course, Eddie Eddie is her latest book, and we'll talk about that too in a wee while. She's also the editor of The Annual with Susan Paris, which is a miscellany of all kinds of writing to be disseminated to schools, or at least those schools that still read. And on that point, I do want to mention her advocacy for writing and reading in schools. You've been doing this. I see Gavin sitting down here. You and Gavin must be probably have done this more than any other writer I can think of.
Just only because we're old.
Well, I didn't want to say that, but nonetheless, you have journeyed to schools, right around the country, talking about how essential reading and books are. Given the abdication of the Ministry of Education to actually suggest literature as a worthwhile activity for our children, let alone find a place for it in its curriculum or teachers who can understand it. Anyway, I can hear a note of grievance entering my voice. So I better move on to the topic of this conversation, which is place and story. And I want to begin by suggesting place is as much a creation as story is. I mean, did London exist before Dickens? Was there ever a Treasure Island before Robbie Louis Stevenson invented that place? Without Dublin, there is no Ulysses. But after Ulysses, what does that Dublin look like? One becomes a reflection of the other to some extent. Without ancestral land to save from developers, there's no Potokee by Patricia Grace. Without Oamaru, there is no Ours de Cry. More strangely, without the Hungarian Plains, there is no Gerald Murnane book called The Plains. Gerald's never been to Hungary, but this is the way writers cobble together landscapes for their books, and it's a strange amalgam of the Australian plains and this imaginary place. Back home again, did we ever see or really understand that place in our community where violence is dished out casually and broken homes and broken dreams are piled on top of one another until Alan Duff delivered that place to us through its broken language? And in Kate's new book, Eddie, Eddie, where she writes, and I quote, Eddie maintained a mealy mouth towards the west side of town. It had largely escaped crippled houses, insured roads, mud baths, fused schools, no-go parks, bulldozed shops, insurance bastards, ... end of quote. Without knowing anything else about that passage, we know she's describing Christchurch, don't we? And place is inextricably wrapped around the tendrils of story. Place is also a writer's collaborator in making the invented appear real. If a reader is introduced to a fictitious character walking along Sinclair Street in Blenheim, they're more likely to believe in that character because Sinclair Street exists. Not only that, they tend to, they may have even walked that street themselves and will suddenly, as a reader, invest some of themselves in that particular rendering of that moment, which is a fiction. It's a strange collaborative act then between the reader and the text, where place is remade according to individual experience. For example, all of us, if we were all set the task of describing the hills around Blenheim, I bet we'd all come up with completely different landscapes according to our relationship, our particular relationship with those hills, and our language capabilities. Capabilities is possibly the wrong word, but our own personal language. So landscape is a kind of a personal interaction, I think. We think of it as a generic position, don't we? We think the mountains are the mountains and the hills are the hills, and everybody will have the same relationship with them, and therefore they exist as one predictable entity. But I don't think that's the case at all. I think we make landscape, we make it up. Place also takes us back to history, and characters are just passing through somewhere called Sinclair Street in Blenheim. But that place was once called Waiharakeke. I hope I pronounced that correct. The Water of Flax, a name that conjures up a confluence of two rivers. In the process of writing, place works on a writer's mind the way a grit of sand does to produce the pearl. It is transactional. And what results is not an accurate representation of place, but a dreamt place with its roots in the real. For a writer, place is a foundry where the inert and alive spirits grind away at one another. Now, I have lived in many houses in different countries, and I've looked out a great deal of windows. And every one of those windows should have delivered me to a new place and a new story. Sometimes they have, but there is one place that dominates, and to its windows I return, especially to its kitchen, where most of the living in that house was done. And those windows are at 20 Stollen Street, Lower Hutt, where I grew up. I return there, I think, because it returns me to my first view out onto the world. So perhaps I go back there to recover an eye of innocence, a clean eye, so that I might see the world again with the same freshness and astonishment of all those years ago. But rather than start here, Kate, because we'll sort of get onto this business of landscape and how we traverse it, both as writers and readers soon, I thought I'd begin with a couple of lines from a favourite poet of mine, Robert Haas, American poet. The poem is called A Talk at Sewanee, and the pertinent lines are these. The things they call your influences are the books that introduce you to yourself. The books that introduce you to yourself. I love that phrase, and I thought that is the place for us to begin. So, Kate, what were the books that introduced the young Kate de Goldi to herself, and which ones did you seek out and track down in terms of their real place in the world?
There were many and various, to the degree that they were from many places in the British Isles or in America. And I was basically, my reading life as a child was fed by this torrent of fabulous literature, post-war literature for children that came from those two places principally. And that was the consequence of deeply talented people and a very intentional publishing industry and what used to be known as lady editors in those publishing houses, all threaded through children's publishing, especially since the Second World War, is the work of indomitable, incredibly well-read women with a mission. And I was lucky enough to have those books bought for me a lot of the time, as well as getting them from the library. And the really useful thing about owning books is that you reread them. And that is why, I mean, not everyone can own books, so libraries are deeply important. But, you know, and I count it as a privilege to have had books that I could continually return to. And I'm absolutely certain that's what made me a writer, because without being aware of the lessons, I learnt the music of sentence making, the meshing of setting and character, and I guess to the sort of shape of story and the notion of plot or tension. So at regular intervals, I would reread certain books for certain things. And I want to say here that these were deeply literary texts. You know, the books of that period were written by seriously literary people. It's just that they were published for children. And when I started thinking about this, I was kind of surprised that the first thing that popped into my head, and I've just brought it just to show you, because, you know, they're totemic, was The Family from One End Street. And has anyone here ever read that series? Oh, great. Yeah. It's a series, and this is a famous book. It won the Carnegie Medal. Its writer and illustrator Eve Garnett. It's allegedly, and probably truly, the first story for children in England about a working class family. The father is a rubbishman and the mother is a washerwoman.
Which decade, Kate?
Sorry?
Which decade?
It's 1930s. And I mean, there's been some criticism of this book in times past because, in a way, Eve Garnett was writing from a different position. So she was writing about this family not having necessarily experienced their world, but you feel as a child when you read it that it's deeply authentic, and it's about the 7 children of the Ruggles family. And when I first read this book, what I cared about was what was happening to the children, but as the rereadings happened over the years, I became aware of the place much more acutely, and it's set in an unnamed town in the south of England, but you can locate it because there's a river running through the town, and it's the Otwell, and the Ouse River, and the town is called Otwell on the Ouse. But it's actually Lewis, L-E-W-E-S. And I didn't learn this till later when I talked to Susan Price, who's a bibliophile, especially with children's books, and she has, in her own slightly crazy way, anatomized the landscape of every children's book ever in the history of the world and has file cards on them. So she could pull out the file card on Sussex and tell me exactly where the railway station is here, etc., etc. And in later readings still, when I was reading a wonderful English series called the Mental Maths series by Barbara Willard, it's historical and it's set in the 200 years between 1485 and the English Civil War, and it follows two families working in the Weald in Kent and Sussex. So they become, in a way, part of history, even though it's their ordinary lives that's being... in fact, the stories are about how ordinary people get thrown about by big events, and because they're horse breeders and ironmongers, or they're smithies, naturally their work ends up being part of the wars over those periods. But when I was reading, in later years, when I was reading these books, they're set in the Weald, which is not that Lewis is the next town, or the nearest town. And so these books became interconnected. And I think, and this still surprises me, the deep layered history of place and person in England has always fascinated me. And I mean, I don't have an English drop in my blood as far as I know, but I felt drawn to England when, very belatedly, at the age of 44, I finally went overseas. And for me, the only way to go overseas was to go to the places of the books. That sort of gave a spine to my travels. And I started off by visiting writers that I really admired. And one of them is a woman called Jan Mark, who has written in all parts of England. Brilliant writer, died prematurely, tragically. And one of her books, which I admired for its technical prowess, is a book of stories called Enough is Too Much Already. And all it is three teenagers wandering around Norwich, talking to each other, and that's how she makes story. And it's brilliantly, managed. And I've read that over and over and used it as a teaching tool. So, of course, I had to go to Norwich and walk the streets there and sort of be those characters. But most of all, I wanted to go to Lewis, and I wanted to go to the Weald. And of course, if you walk around London, you bump into story everywhere. Mary Poppins is in Kensington. Leon Garfield is walking his characters up Ludgate Hill. There wasn't an inch of that city that wasn't in story. And finally, on about my third trip to the UK, my sister came with me, and she too had read the Mental Math stories, and we became obsessed with English cathedrals because they also appear in children's stories all the time. And one of my favourite pieces from Tom's Midnight Garden. How many of you have read that? A great, voted the Carnegie of Carnegie medals, this book. It's a time slip story, and in the story, Tom goes back to Victorian, or maybe Edwardian England, and makes friends with a girl called Hattie. And at one point in the winter, in times past, they're skating down, I'm not sure which river it is, towards Ely, the city of Ely. And there's this astonishing passage where they suddenly see that, Ely Cathedral is called the Ship of the Fens, and they see it as they're skating towards it. I haven't managed to skate towards Ely, but I've been to Ely many times, and of course it recurs in other pieces of English literature. But Claire and I, my sister and I, decided that we would take a small moment at the end of this book, which is about the fifth book in the Mental Math series, where the family fracture means that the oldest son, so we're in the early 1500s, he has to move away from the family to make his own way, and he's going to go to Gloucester. And you have to imagine that they're names, these places, but these people have often never been to them, and they make their way to Gloucester over many, many days, and they do it by visiting the cathedral towns. But they begin at Lewis Priory, which is in the family from One End Street, and they get blessed by the friar. And then they make their way to Chichester, to Winchester Cathedral, where, of course, they get succour and harbour from the monks that are in these cathedrals, although a lot of them have already been sent away because of Henry VIII. And they finally... And then they finish up at Salisbury Cathedral. So my sister and I did all those cathedrals. Of course, we didn't walk and we didn't have a horse and cart, but we kind of lived the story, or the end of that story, which is a seminal part of the, or pivotal part of the whole series. Magnificent, yeah. Long answer.
You have a different relationship with place. So you meet this place initially through these books, and it's an exhilarating moment where you enter into that space, and your own world is suddenly enhanced and expanded, and so on. But then when you want to hunt down that place, its real place in the world. I don't think you're going necessarily back just as a pilgrim, particularly if you're a writer. You're going back because you want to see how something was made. You know, here's the kindling, the real place, and you know, and then you're looking for the spark, the creative spark that lit the thing. I find that all very interesting.
So how did that happen for you in your seminal book, Emil and the Detectives?
Yeah, trust Kate to actually have a copy. Well done, Kate.
My second copy, because the first one fell apart. I got that at a fair.
Oh, right, okay. Well, look, there were a couple of books. There was one called The Goalkeeper's Revenge by Bill McNaughton, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. And there was a story there called Tinker Boy. And there were drawings, and it was a landscape. It was very stark. I didn't recognise it, and I immediately felt sorry for him because he didn't have a lawn like we did. But I recognised this animal spirit in this boy. It was some that first little interesting thing that you find some aspect of yourself in an imaginary person, and some magic begins to exert itself. But this book, Emil and the Detectives by Eric Kastner. Are you familiar with this? There must be if you got on. Oh, well done. Yeah, well done. God knows how it found its way into our house in 1960-something.
So it was in the public library?
No.
It
was actually bought for me. I'd love to know how.
Well, I can tell you how, because this is in the 1950s? 60s, yeah. So Puffin, that's what was available in bookshops in New Zealand at that point. Puffin was spreading classics like that round the world, and that would have been reprinted. In fact, it's been multiply reprinted.
Yeah.
And we had some really good booksellers in the 60s in all the cities who were really dedicated to children's books. So doubtless someone recommended it in a shop.
Yes, well, the other miracle is somebody took up the challenge of buying it. Anyway, it was a story you mentioned about rereading, and I would have read this book at least 30 times. And when I was at primary school, I was predictably sick once a year, a stomach bug. And I'd walk home and try not to throw up all the way home until I got home.
No one came and got you?
No. I would have been mortified if somebody had turned up to get me.
Right.
Staggered home along the hedges, and after throwing up in the bath, I'd be very lightheaded. And Emil and Detectives, I'd sort of read my way back into wellness again. And I knew the story backwards. And it was sort of a story of betrayal, really. The adult world betrays this boy, Emil. Emil was on a train from what's called, it's a bit like what you were saying before about this, the writer concealing place, from a place called Neustadt. And is on his way to Berlin. And his mother has put some money in an envelope and pinned it to his lapel. He's to give that money to his grandmother. His grandmother and Polly, his cousin, are waiting for him in Alexanderplatz, I think. It's about a 2-hour journey, which would place it at Dresden. That's in later years. That's where I calculate. Indeed, that I was proven right. But I'll come to that in a second. He's on the train, and of course, this man gives him a piece of chocolate to eat, which he can't resist. Eats it, falls asleep. When he wakes. The train is at Zugarten. And on the platform in the crowd, he can see the man that has given him the chocolate, immediately feels for his money. Money's not there, leaves the train and follows this man to his hotel. And of course, the hotel is an adult world. He can't really enter into that world. At some point, he runs into the detectives. These are street kids around the Zugarten area. And have an elaborate plan to keep an eye on Grundy's the thief. Grundy's the thief goes between this hotel and a very, very famous cafe called Costi, Cafe Costi. And I am in Stalin Street, Lower Hutt, enraged that this thief is drinking coffee on the spoils of Emil's money that's supposed to go to his grandmother and so on. And but he's surrounded by these very street savvy kids. Anyway, long story short, they find a way to alert the police. The police believe him, and Grundy is turned over. But Eric Kastner, being the clever writer he is, he was a newspaper man at the time. In the story, a newspaper man called Eric Kastner turns up to interview the kids. And it's a way of saying, well, this is how I found the story, Now, this book was one of the books that was thrown onto the bonfire at Bebelplatz by the Nazis. Eric Kastner turned up to his own book burning. And it's very typical of his sense of humour that he went along to his own book burning. It was thrown there on the pyre because it was seen as being dangerous, that children would question that
they were kind of delinquent.
Well, they're questioning the accepted order of things, that parents know best and all the rest of it.
Happening at this very moment in the United States.
You would think it would have died out. Well, it's happening. Come back to that actually, Kate. It's happening everywhere. Anyway, when I was in Berlin, I made a point of tracking down the landscape of this book because I was very keen to know more about Kastner and how he had put this book together because it had such an impact on me. So, of course, a lot of Berlin had been destroyed during the war, and Cafe Costi was one of those places. He worked on a newspaper, so he had his mornings free, and so he would set out and he would walk across the Kudamm near Zugarten. We were living a few blocks away from the Zugarten. So I knew this landscape very well, then down Nollendorf, I think, Nollendorfstrasse. And then the landscape just peters out because it's all destroyed. People who have been to Berlin might have been to Potsdamer Platz. It's those modern glass buildings. That's where Cafe Costi was. To this day, there is a cafe there, and there are fragments from the old cafe that are embedded in the walls of the new cafe. That was thrilling to discover.
I had the same thing with Lewis Priory, which is a ruin now. The tracery.
I think maybe you have to be a writer to know how thrilling this is. It's like Carter opening the Tutankhamun's sort of crypt, really.
It's a concretization of the sort of magical alchemy of you reading it and then finding it in the world, or the other way around sometimes, isn't it? Because I didn't go to Germany for many years, and I was just excited to see Potsdamer Platz because it's in the book,
Yes. Anyway, I'll just quickly finish this off about Emil and the detective. So I went to Dresden. A new start, Dresden's divided between the old city and new city. His mother was actually Emil's mother. To make money is washing hair in the front rooms of the house. Kastner's mother did the same thing. The father was a leather worker, but their ambition was slowly to move in these apartments closer and closer to this very desired place, which was just near the bridge over the Elbe, where his wealthy uncle had this place. The wealthy uncle's house is now the Eric Kastner Museum. And
I didn't know that.
Yes, and it's full of Kastner kind of bits of humour. You go into this museum, and they're all people of perhaps our vintage who read this book in the 60s, and they were from all over the world, Anyway, there'll be a cabinet, and you open a drawer, and there'll be an envelope. You're allowed to open the envelope, which I did. And there's a letter that Kastner tells against himself. He's got a copy of this book, and he's at something like a book signing or something, and he sees this girl walk towards him with her book, and he grabs it off her and hurriedly writes his signature and hands it back. She's aghast. He's defaced her book. But then she sees that he's written in pencil, And Castner says she was very relieved because she could now erase it with a rubber. I love that story.
Yeah, and I mean, it's entirely consistent. The whole tone of the book is a little bit hilarious, isn't it? It's an adventure, but not a scary one. There's a sort of, and it's partly because the children are such a persuasive pack of fellows, you know. I mean, they're looking after each other. And it's a classic children's story because really the adults are banished and the baddie's the adult, and the betrayal of the child by the adult is a real children's books, you know, trope. And they solve it by themselves, or at least they have the agency to go to the police and get help.
Yes, and they sort of mimic the adult world in terms of organising themselves and all that sort of thing.
Which is, I mean, it's true children's literature.
Yeah.
What, two things. You know, when you said you see a little bit of yourself one day in a book, and you saw that in the soccer book, you know, the
Tinker Boy.
Yeah, you had a feeling of some communion with that character.
Yeah.
When I first read Emil and the Detectives, and I think I was about 7 or 8, the thing that really intrigued me was on the first page where the mother, Mrs. Tichborne, is having her hair done. And that's what my mother used to do with Mrs. Utslag next door. She'd come and they'd use beer and spray it on her hair. And I just, it somehow enabled me to plant myself in the book. It was a familiar thing, having someone come and do the hairdressing at the kitchen table, you know? But the other thing that blew me away about that book, Lloyd, was I, of course, because I was a child, I didn't realise that it was set in the 30s. And so
late 20s, actually.
So it's before Hitler comes to power. Yeah, okay.
Right on the cusp.
Yeah. But it then takes on a kind of semi-tragic patina when you know that later, because you're reading about a place and an innocence that can never be there again in Berlin.
Well, the Hitler thing enters into it in Billy Wilder's film, Emil and the Detectives. Fabulous film.
I haven't seen
and
it.
in the carriage, there is a description of some of the other passengers in the carriage by Kastner, but Billy Wilder puts a couple of Orthodox Jews in there as a provocative kind of thing in the film, and then quickly buggered off to Hollywood.
Any chance 20 Stalin Street will become the Lloyd Jones Museum, do you think? But it's not nothing, is it? I mean, that's an edifice-like story and a site for story that's just lodged in your head forever.
Yeah, it is. And I was talking to Kate about this. Whenever I've had to write a scene that's in a kitchen, I just cannot think of any other kitchen than the one at 20 Stalin Street. And I think a lot of living happens in that kitchen, and at a young age, and when things cut deep and make impressions, and the views out into the world, the portals are all there. And I'm going back to the source of language, of course. And
character,
and
one way or another.
Yeah.
Because that's where, as a child, you're watching adult interplay, you're listening to stuff that you only half understand. So it's, you know, I mean, it's kind of the place of story, isn't it?
It is.
And I'd argue that the kitchen is the place of New Zealand story particularly, because that's where everything happens.
Well, it's, in my case, I'd say it's the birthplace of imagination, really. But
can I ask you something?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me we're quite different in some ways.
No.
Yeah, well, beyond the obvious, in terms of place, because you at least venture out and come to grips with other places. I mean, you have gone all over the world and sought story, or story has come to you as you've been all over the world. But then that odd thing that you're talking about still happens when you're writing about, say, what's a good example? I don't know. Here at the end of the world, we learn to dance. It reaches as far as South America, but it's also in Punakaiki. But somewhere in there is also 20 Stalin Street, not necessarily physically, but but you've had a kind of, I mean, I think of you as being adventurous in terms of place.
Well,
what does it do for you, another place?
I'm going to these places for a specific reason, and I'm led by a particular thing that's in me, which is an interest in identity. But there's, as writers, we are explorers and we're magpies and we're stitching together places and landscapes and, I think as we've lived in the 20th century, we've lived in an increasingly larger world, and we don't just live in the house and the street that we grew up in. God, I begin the day each day reading the New York Times. But just back on here at the end of the world, we learn to dance. I have Kate to thank actually for leading me to a bit of landscape at Punakaiki, and Kate showed me these caves where World War I pacifists lived for a while. As soon as she showed me this piece, I thought, oh Jesus, I have to have that. Kate, do you mind? So it was a bit of a land grab on my part, because she could have easily, and if you'd said no, it's mine, I would have understood, and therefore it wouldn't have been in here at the end of the world. Kate,
but it was, as a reader, it was really exciting for me to see those caves in that book.
Yes.
So you sort of elevated them and transformed them interestingly and saw them differently to me. So there's all sorts of exchange going on anyway, isn't there, through the reading?
Yeah, and it's an interesting. It doesn't happen that often where the place, sends me back into the story. Usually, it's the other way around. That the story sort of spreads into a place. I was going to ask you something actually, Kate, because I was going to mention Sol Billow. He, the great American novelist, was struggling with writing a particular novel one time, and then suddenly he heard a voice from childhood, and it was this kid that used to run around saying the same thing all the time, and it was, "Hey, have I got a deal for you?" And suddenly the south side of Chicago ballooned in his ear, and I was thinking how actually in writing, it's not like we're looking out the window and thinking, oh, I'm going to place a story there. It begins with voice and leads us to place. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you have ever had an experience like that.
I have. And I should say here, actually, that having been friends with Lloyd over 30 years now, the notion of voice was something you articulated for me. I knew what it was, but I didn't have the name for it. I realised that that's what pulled me into story. But as a writer, Lloyd once gave me a fabulous quote that he'd written down about what voice is in a story, and ever since then, that has been primary for me. When I was first writing in that very kind of usual way, the voice was always the first person because it had a kind of an insistence and a throat-grabbing kind of feeling about it, and an urgency that you wanted the story to have. But since then, I'm kind of really love the third person, partly because it feels like the ultimate old story voice, and it's technically more, it's more difficult really, well for me anyway. But I think for me, Lloyd, the voice is always about the character thinking. That's really what's driving the story. I have quite limited literary skills really, and the one thing that I keep doing is bringing the reader back to the head of the character. My favourite thing is to have the character walking or driving and thinking, and that's how a lot of the story gets told. I'm sure that says something about me, because for many years I never went anywhere and just read books, so it was sort of about the head.
Well, there's a huge amount of interiority in Eddie, and it's when I was reading it, it struck me that there are two bedrocks in the book. One, of course, is The Christmas Carol, Dickens, that provided you with a structure and a few ideas about characterization, and the other is Christchurch. And one of the challenges that writers face is how to find something that can kind of collect the idea of place. And I think you did it with Eddie, because this character, his thoughts, he's almost sort of breaking down before you. He's disassembling. Things are just pouring out of him. It's like his self is crumbling, which is, and the parallel, of course, is Christchurch, with it falling out of itself. So you've sort of personified a difficult thing, I think. Kate, I just realised the time. It's 12:40, and we actually organised 4 pieces to read to you. Well, that's not going to happen. So, but maybe you could read that piece you wanted to read about.
The little bit of In contrast to you, it's really, but similarly to you, 20 Stellan Street for you. Well, for me, it is the topography of Christchurch, certain houses, certain streets. I really can't set a story anywhere else. I tried to set the 10 p.m. question in Lowry Bay in Wellington, and the characters were walking down the zigzag to the bottom, and when they got there, they were in Kashmir and Christchurch. And I just gave up. And it's absolutely central. And of course, when Christchurch crumbled, it was devastating on so many levels. But in a very selfish way, I thought, far out, this is going to perpetually disrupt how my writing works. So I'm finding my way back through that, I suppose. But the piece that Lloyd suggested to read is set in a New World supermarket. And I suppose, that is a place in life. I seem to live there. I go there at least once every couple of days. And I've always wanted to set a story in a supermarket, but it just became a scene. And it's a place for Eddie where, in a funny way, he's found a new community because he's abandoned some of his old ones for various reasons. And the other sort of voice in this book is his friend Toss Moore, who's forever in Eddie's head. And so a lot of the stuff that Eddie tells you is sort of about explaining Toss. And Toss hates supermarkets because he thinks they're just, which they are, monopolies and, exploit their producers and pay their labour crap. But we need them, and we're actually hostage to them. And Eddie agrees with Toss, but he's found that the supermarket is something else for him. Toss was fully wrong about the supermarket. It wasn't a terrible place. It was marvellous, a great clockwork universe with dozens of moving parts, a glorious, edifying cooperative, a new world. It was an alternative family at least, encompassing multitudes, unlike his own extended family, which now comprised just an uncle, a first cousin once removed, and a second cousin who lived in Timaru. They were an etiolated clan, barely worthy of the name. His supermarket family, though, it was full and fabulous, thrillingly ordinary and lunatic. Brad, the butchery apprentice, for instance, who could rap lyrically on lamb and beef cuts, mincing methods, and the underappreciated beauty of offal. Bernadine, tiny and wrinkled, who moved like a wind-up mouse. She worked every possible shelf-filling shift to get away from her husband and could provide in-the-moment coded commentary on high-maintenance customers. Elefosio, the bakery manager, whenever they saw Eddie, they enveloped him in a lengthy hug and begged him to join the New World Touch team. Marcus, the liquor manager of indeterminate age, shy and prone to stuttering, who had blurted to him one day last December that he was flying to Wellington to hear the Messiah. Eddie had been astonished on so many counts. That did actually happen to me in the New World. And Shimura in the deli, beautiful as the day. Sometimes he bought ham slices or scotched eggs just to watch her wielding the tongs, weighing and wrapping, handing over packages with a gloved hand and a spectacular smile. And of course, the trolley boys. He watched them on coffee breaks. They were fierce and determined and wrenchingly humorous. Each had his own collecting system and strange navigational path around the car park. They were almost balletic with their trolley trains and long-suffering with the ruder clientele who roared across their paths in high-up cars. Not a flick across the trolley boys' faces. They had been schooled. They all had, never to show the slightest exasperation, even to the most imperious of matrons, of which there were plenty, by the way, on the west side of the ragged city. Yeah.
I was thinking what you were talking about third person. It's an authorial voice that's riding in over the top there, and placing Eddie in that thing, which is a great advantage really to have. I quite like that. You can make a larger world, and you can arrange it accordingly.
Yeah. But you can still have the intimacy with the interiority.
Exactly.
So it's what they call close third person?
Yes.
Yeah. I know these things instinctively, but not always what they're called.
Yeah.
But Lloyd, can I ask you? You said something about in Amel and the Detectives about meeting Kastner in the story because he's a newspaper man, and you said, and that sort of gives a rationalisation for why the story is being told. And that's something that you've always talked about. Lloyd often talks about his books as he's writing them, or the concept of them, which is always so interesting. But one of the things you're always looking for is the reason why the story is being told.
Well, I think stories have to have an urgency. And so that brings to question, what's the relationship between the narrator and the story he or she is telling? Why? How has that person come into that material? And Kastner is answering that question by saying, well, I was tidying up the bits and pieces of that story as a newspaper man. He didn't really need to do that, but
you recognise it as a writer.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's and I don't, as a child, of course, I just accepted that that's all part of the story. But once you become a writer, you know, it's a bit like mechanics knowing how cars work. You know how this book is operating. You're looking at its internal logic and structure and what's the spark and why is it being told. These are important questions, I think. And to readers too, I think, you know.
And that question of yours, who's telling the story, is always there for me because of you. When I start a book, I sort of now can't do it unless I really know the reason for the text being put down. And I was writing this book and thinking, who's really telling it? And something had to happen halfway through because of what you'd said. It's really interesting having writer friends. Often you don't talk about writing, do you? But every now and again you do. And I am definitely grateful to things Lloyd has articulated over the years that have, you know, stuck with me. Can I ask you another story about place? Another question?
Sure. I was just going to say though that third person authorial voice is, of course, what operates for Dickens and Christmas Carol.
Yes. So in that way, there are little coded echoes of Dickens all the way through there. Lloyd, you go to places that have definite landscapes, but also particular cultures and particular moments of turbulent history, Mr. Pip. But I'm thinking of biography.
Oh, yeah.
And you went there and you say there's usually something that's led you there. And it wasn't so much the place, it was the fact that the place had been absent from the world for 40 years, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you went there and...
With Kate's husband, by the way.
For 6 weeks in 1990 when there were still faxes but nothing else. We had a very young child, 2 young children, and a fax came through one day and it was like buried treasure describing what was happening. So when you got there, did the place have an effect on you? Or was it this sort of stitching of people, place and culture and history?
It's a huge question, Kate.
Yeah, I know. We haven't got time. Yeah. Answer it in 2 sentences.
Well, look, you know, I studied politics, so I was very interested, and I studied Marxism and so forth. And, you know, at that time in our lives, we had thought that the Iron Curtain would be there for forever and a day. And Albania was sort of the last brick in the wall, really, to give way. And it had been removed from the world's view for decades. And when Foz and I got there, you had this sense, people stared at you. We went to villages, they hadn't seen a foreigner for half a century, and they just stared at us. And we went through all the camps and we interviewed, you know, terrible stories, terrible situations. It was a traumatised population. They'd been through tremendous trauma.
When did the spark of story happen there?
Well, they had the system of biography, and it was a way of keeping records on everybody in the country, and they were sort of, you would get to write your biography to some extent, and the last thing you wanted to do was have some sort of genealogical link to a previous generation that filled positions of power. So your biography was
kind of a fiction.
It was a fiction, and yet it was a fiction that had tremendous impact in your circumstances, your day-to-day circumstances. So it was the first time, I think, that I realised how amorphous identity is. It can be what it needs to be at any moment in time. And I think it was that particular thing. And hearing that Enver Hoxha had a double, that was the key. And that really sort of set things alight. But look, I think it's question time, if anyone has questions.
Yes, there's a question there.
Yeah, Lloyd, I'm fascinated by the idea of place. You and I grew up surfboard riding. I wondered whether you'd ever thought of the oceans and the sea as a place.
Oh, absolutely. Well, in this book, my latest book, The Fish, the sea it's pretty much a character.
It's a character, and it's a major metaphor as well.
Yeah. As I said in conversation with Kate the other night, it sort of represents the subconscious. I think you can see the lid of the sea, but you can't plummet its depths. But
Lloyd, can I just remind you, Lloyd wrote a fabulous essay for Susan Paris and I for Annual 2, which is called...
About body surfing, wasn't it?
It's about body... We asked him to write about body surfing. I just can't remember what the title is. But I've used it to teach with because it's... the voice is extremely sort of conversational and matey, so it's interesting to show young writers that. But Lloyd makes the sea an absolute character in that. The sea has... the waves have a shoulder, the sea has a face, and it's like you're making friends with the sea or discovering it. It's really potent, and if you haven't read it, it's marvelous, and it's totally about his love and affection, but told in a way that implies it rather than is explicit. Yeah. There's
Dave is, I think, talking about the relationship that surfers have with the sea, which is also different again, which is a curious sort of dance. And surfers are really good at reading the ocean, at reading the weather, tides and all this sort of thing. It becomes a very intimate part of your life, doesn't it, Dave?
Do you still surf, Dave?
I look for smaller waves.
Yeah. Any other questions? Colleen?
Hi. We often hear at the moment that young people need to read themselves and their own places in books, and I totally agree with that to a point. But like myself, you both grew up reading of other places and other people, and I sort of think that story is all about finding out about the big wide world and how other people think and how other people feel, and reading about other cultures and getting empathy in there as well. I'd just like to know, as writers, what your opinion is.
Well, Kate said it yesterday in your talk. You said, well, yeah, we read to have something reiterated in ourselves, but we also read to escape ourselves. And we do have this great ability to enter into other spaces and into the skins of other people and so on. And like, you know, 1960s Lower Hutt, there's according to today, you know, the way the rhetoric is today, I shouldn't be able to understand these kids because, look, they dress differently and men are wearing Homburg hats and so on. It's just absolute nonsense, of course. But it also overlooks the fact of the reader as the maker of the story. There's no doubt about that. That we read ourselves into a story. And it doesn't matter where it is set. You know, you could be a Chibi's, you know, things fall apart. It's a story set in the 1950s Africa. I am there. I understand these people. And the text, good writing makes that possible. It sort of, you enter into it, or it invites you into it. And
then it enters you.
And it enters you. I mean, particularly I think when you're being read to, Kate, if you're being read to, it enters you and it passes out of you and you have remade it as it leaves you. There's some, and it's just coming right back to landscape as well. I think the same thing happens. It becomes sort of transfigured through language, through your writing about it,
Yeah, and in the inevitable way that we make binary all these issues, there's overcorrection, especially in children's publishing. Of course we need diversity across children's reading, and we need all the different New Zealanders to find themselves on the page, and publishing's trying to address that. But for me, there would be utter poverty in a worldview if a child only had the mirror half of the mirror and window equation. And for sure, when we were growing up, I mean, we've journeyed hugely because of the books we were reading. And I will never forget the moment where I read The Runaway Settlers. And Elsie Locke was naming the Taramako, the Terrible Cow River, I couldn't believe it because, every summer I rode along it in Governor's Bay, etc. And that's special and priceless. But, I mean, both things have to be there. Of course they do. And also, I think what's behind this idea of affirming to the exclusion of other things is the idea that children may be or will be baffled and frightened if they don't immediately understand what they read. And I think we have to accept that reading is also often about not understanding and being patient and learning how to read. Susan Paris was talking about it yesterday, about how you approach a poem. Its language, talked to its ultimate, and it's not always explicable, but it's not about things being immediately explicable. Slow down, be patient with text, and that's being lost with our kids because of all the other things that are going on.
Well said, Kate. Yeah. This not necessarily having to understand. It's not like a comprehension test. And you can re-engage with it, and it still lives in you in some way. Like often, if I'm feeling a bit flat in terms of writing, I'll read Anne Carson, the great Canadian poet, and some of her poems are very, very difficult in the sense that they don't really declare themselves.
No.
But you have this funny sensation of having understood something. It just sort of flares up and dies in the very same moment that you recognise that you've finally understood something. Isn't that enough? Isn't that a rare kind of experience?
And also, you have to practice reading. I mean, the people who first listened to Schoenberg, were just baffled by this, the textures and the harmonies. But now we listen to Schoenberg, and as a culture, he sounds melodious in a way that he didn't then. So I think it's the same thing with reading. When I was a teen, one of the books I read over and over again was called Dinky Hocker Shoots Smack, which was by a fantastic American writer called M.E. Kerr, who'd had a whole life writing underground lesbian stories before she published for children. And she has a character, and she's making a good point about how we read our political enemies too narrowly. And there's a character called P. John Knight he's got a socialist Marxist father, and he's become right-wing. But he's a very funny character, and at one stage he stands up and gives a talk in the class, and no one understands him because he doesn't have the liberal voice and ideas that they will want. And he says, "Don't understand me too quickly." And it's a quote from somewhere, but I don't know where. I have known, but I've forgotten. But that stayed with me forever. I mean, it's a mantra as a writer and a reader, isn't it?
On that lovely point, I think we have to end.
Okay.
It's 1:00.
Thanks, Lloyd.